Good afternoon and good morning to those of you that have joined from the States. As always, we're just going to wait a few seconds for people to join us today and just to settle in. So we'll just give it a few more seconds. This is the only silent part of the webinar. Fingers crossed anyway. Okay, so are we ready to start, everyone? Yep, good. Okay, so as I say, thank you for joining us today. We've got a very popular webinar this afternoon because I think everyone wants to know which country is the hardest to pay, even though I think John might have a bit of updated news on that. So I'm just going to pass this over to David, who is your host today. And if you have any questions, please ask them in the question box today.
Thank you, Mel, and welcome everyone to this webinar. We will be talking about the new payroll efficiency report and obviously covering some of the challenges of doing payroll in various countries. So let's start by introducing the panel. So I'm David Brock. I'm the CMO here at CloudPay based in the US, and I'll be guiding us through this presentation today. I'm also joined by two of my colleagues. And John, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hi everybody, thanks for joining. John Pierce, Head of Payroll Operations at CloudPay. Pleasure to be here today and really looking forward to getting the discussion going.
Thank you, John. Marlene?
Hi everyone, my name is Marlene Fellis-Berto and I am the Global Director of Solution Consultants here at CloudPay. Just like David, I am based in the States and I'm really looking forward to sharing some of the information that we found on the new PEI report.
Well, this expert panel will walk us through a series of topics today. We'll start with a little bit of why standard SLAs aren't enough. The typical SLA in the industry is timeliness and accuracy, but they do fall short on giving us real-time analysis of what's going on. We're going to move into the section that everyone wants to know. Where is it most difficult to do payroll? Then we'll go talk about resilient payroll challenges. We'll look at the global PEI. And because this is not the first version of this report, we can actually benchmark and compare to how some of these new KPIs have moved across regions, across time. So what is the PEI report? For those of you unfamiliar with this, this is a global report that looks at 5 KPIs by country that we believe give a better perspective on how payroll is performing. We'll talk about what those KPIs are shortly. This is our second edition of the report, and it's going to look at payroll performance. We'll essentially look at those in a second. But the data behind this report, it consists of a sample of over 1,500 payrolls with over 1 million payslips that were generated between January 1st and December 31st of 2020. So we're looking at data from the first year of the pandemic. We will have a follow-up report on this very soon that will look at last year's data, but today we're going to just cover the data from 2020. And with that, I'll let John take us through the next section.
Thanks, David. So why are my SLAs green if my payroll team feels red? It's a sentiment that really resonates with a lot of payroll practitioners that I speak with. SLAs in payroll are the absolute fundamentals. As David mentioned, the main ones that are used are for timeliness and accuracy. And hopefully they're always green. And there's many reasons for that, but particularly because payroll practitioners tend to never stop until they've got their SLA green, until they've made that payroll accurate and timely. What it doesn't tell you and what it doesn't allow you to report upon is how much effort, how much pain, how much frustration, or how easily and how effective that payroll run was delivered. And so at CloudPay, working with the customers, we've developed some other KPIs, some other measures that we use to analyze payroll performance and look to get our payroll teams feeling green as well, not green sick, just green happy. So David, do you want to move us up? So there's lots of KPIs that you can look at regarding your payroll performance and process in order to gain a deeper understanding of how effective it is and where there may be opportunities to drive improvement. These are 5 of our favorite ones that we feel give a really good insight into how that payroll is performing, but also by tracking this data, give a really good opportunity to perform deeper root cause analysis and really understand where some of your issues are and where you may be able to take some process improvement changes to help get a better, more effective payroll delivery. First one here is first time approval. So what we mean by that is from the starting point of the payroll input being submitted, the payroll calculation being performed, and those results being presented, it means that payroll is able to be approved or completed that first time. So there's no rework. We haven't had to reject the payroll and reprocess it because there was some missing data that needs to be included. So the data input process is working well. It means there's no errors been spotted with the calculation. So the configuration and the pre-validation work done by the processing team has worked effectively and well. And it means that when we get to the approval time, we can have we've got a nice length of time to be able to do all of our validation checks appropriately, hit that approve button, and everybody's online with the calendar. So for us, this really is the one that we focus most of our attention on. If this is looking great, it really does show you're doing things well. If this is starting to drop, then it really points you in a direction of looking at some of these other KPIs to understand where the opportunities may lie for improvement. So second one, data input issues. Really, this is a KPI that's all about understanding the quality of data that's being provided to that payroll team, to the payroll calculation engine, in order for them to allow a good calculation to occur. If you're missing data, if the data doesn't load, you're spending time where you want to really be focusing on calculation and validation. You eat into that time and you're spending more time figuring out data issues, correcting misuploads, chasing around other departments and stakeholders to get bits of data they haven't submitted in time. So a really key piece to understand and something we can all work on to improve with our various stakeholders and departments that provide that data input to our payroll teams. So issues, the third one, issues per 1,000 pay slips. So here we're really trying to track and understand how clean the process itself is, how good the calculations are. You'll tend to have a higher issues per 1,000 if you've got calculations that the system is not fully automated, for example. So if you're starting to get an increase here, starting to understand and dig into where those calculations are happening and where there may be an opportunity to enhance your system, to automate some calculations and just remove some of that manual process that's occurring. Calendar length. The joys of agreeing calendar lengths for a payroll cycle. So we have the ongoing competition. That means we want to keep the cutoff as late as possible so that we can get all of our input from the business and we can process everything we need in one clean run. Fighting or contesting with the need from the payroll team to be able to be confident that they have enough time in that process to deal with any data errors, to deal with any calculation issues, and to go through a full validation process to get that approval in time in order to allow the banking and other post-processing activities to happen. So having a look here and understanding how that calendar length looks across countries and across payrolls is really a good insight as to where you might be able to tackle some issues, or you may be able to give some wider benefits to the business by shortening your cycle and getting some additional data into that run. Number 5, supplemental impacts. So how many times do we need to run an off cycle or supplementary run? And in some countries, you can't get around it. You need to run these for levers, you need to run these for bonuses, you need to do these other things. But a lot of the time, a supplemental run can be avoided if you've got your data input clean, if you've got your issues, your configuration clean, and you've allowed enough time in your calendar cycle to perform a comfortable payroll process. So looking here, because of course supplementals are hard to forecast in terms of having the effort and the staff available to do that calculation, but also they do tend to drive cost, which again is hard to forecast. So really keeping an eye on this and working out how you can limit and minimize the amount of off cycles you're running is also a good way to understand how to improve your overall payroll performance. Again, there are many other KPIs. These are the 5 we're going to look at today, and these are the 5 the report focuses on. But interested on the chat, if you've got any other KPIs that you think are particularly important, bash them in the chat. Good opportunity to share those best practices with the rest of the attendees.
Thanks, John. So thank you for setting the scene. These are the 5 KPIs, and we want to get some audience participation in here. So we've got a little bit of a poll for you. So Mel, if you would like to launch the poll.
Yep. Okay. So the question is, which of these countries do you think is the most difficult place to do payroll? So we have Japan, Germany, France, US, China, UK, Italy, UAE, Costa Rica, and other. So, John, what do you think is going to come up as the hardest?
I am going to be surprised if UAE makes it into top spot on the hardest, but I think we're going to be split around some of the others, depending on people's experience that are on the webinar today.
There is one clear favourite.
Okay.
Marlene?
Marlene, you have a guess. What do you think the favourite's going to come out as?
I'm going to go with France as the favorite.
Okay. I think I'm jumping on that bandwagon. I think.
Okay.
I think we've got a comment in, somebody saying that Belgium is missing from the list as well. Is that a tough one?
Yes. Sorry,
Yes.
we could only get 10 options on here. So we chose some, but you can again put your views in the chat. It'd be great to hear from the people on the line today where you think is particularly difficult.
Okay, so let's give it a couple more seconds. Somebody just put Mexico. Well, we've definitely got it. Belgium seems to be a keen one on this one, but let's see what we've got here. So I'm just going to end the poll now, and I'll launch the results.
Oh, I'm glad I jumped on that bandwagon.
Okay, I'll stop sharing those. So obviously we've got France here as the top, and as you're right, John, the others are shared out quite evenly, I would say. And then obviously we've got a few comments with Belgium and some other countries. So over to you, David.
Thank you. I'm going to pass it on to John to tell us a little bit more about complexity.
Thanks, David. So when we were looking into to kind of make our own subjective decision on where payroll is the most difficult, we decided for this particular review, we'd look at factors that were wider than just complexity. I think the complexity of a given country is a great indication of how difficult it can be, but we don't feel like it's the only indication. So complexity can be anything from how many bits of information you need in order to complete a tax calculation or submit a tax form. It can also be the frequency of how often you have to do payroll. A lot of countries are very common, it's just monthly. But there are countries where it's absolutely common practice to run semi-monthly, bi-weekly. We've seen weekly, I've seen one instance of a daily payroll, imagine that. So all of these things can drive the complexity, but we thought some other factors we need to account. So second one we looked at for this particular report was payroll software maturity. And what we mean by that is the availability of the gross and net engine within that country to be able to load all the data in a seamless fashion. So not much rekeying, removes chances of errors, removes chances of making it more difficult. The availability of software that can be configured to do all of the calculations, however difficult those calculations are, to remove the manual calculation element from the process. But also how mature they are in terms of being able to connect to all of the third parties, such as the government, to complete all the submissions that are required in that jurisdiction. The third item we wished to consider for this report was the availability of payroll talent. Now, particularly in a multinational environment, which is where we sit and where our customers are in, which often requires that payroll talent to be able to speak both local language and the business language, typically English. So we're then shrinking our pool of talent down from everybody in that country that can run payroll down to who in that country is bilingual and who in that country also wants to work in a multinational environment, which is often a little bit different to a domestic business. So for each of these 3 factors, we gave the countries on a list a score between 1 and 3. If you're scoring 3, then good for you, you've been rated least difficult. If you're scoring 8 and 9, then in our subjective opinion, we think this country is very difficult. So those are the rules or what we put together in order to come up with this score.
And why don't we share some of the results here? So this is John, I think a little bit of a geography lesson.
Yes. All right. Here we go. So I hope your flag work is better than mine, but I can definitely see we've got France and Italy coming up there, Germany, Argentina, Brazil, the US. I don't think there's too many surprises here, and of course Spain. But I think we've got 2 more to join. When using our matrix to assess difficulty, the 2 we found that were slightly more difficult than the rest here were Japan and China. And that wasn't on a complexity scale. That was more to do with the maturity of the software and the availability of payroll talent in a multinational environment. So there's the results. Again, interested to hear people's opinions on the chat. But we're now also going to look at one of the KPIs we talked about earlier, was first time approval. So what we've done is kind of looked at where first time approval was very high. So let's look at that. There's a nice easy one. Panama scoring 90%. It means 9 out of 10 payrolls that are run in Panama, the first time the result is presented, that result is fully approved and there's no need to reprocess. So 9 out of 10, pretty good statistic for efficiency, but yet it's on here. Now, surprisingly, China, that flashed up as the most difficult, is also now coming through as one of the most efficient in terms of getting that first time approval through. So an interesting perspective, rated as the most difficult, but also showing up as one of the most efficient payrolls being operated. And I'm sure there's lots of underlying factors driving that you can look into the other KPIs to try and get some insight around.
And let's see if there are any questions we want to take here. I don't think that there are any that we haven't answered, but we've also introduced a new matrix this year for how to look at this. Let's see, I did, are these based on CloudPay? John, are these based on CloudPay client experience?
So the difficulty rating is not, that's a subjective view from a number of global payroll experts that have helped us put together that matrix. The first time efficiency percentage is very much from within our customer base. That's where we've collected this data from in order to publish the wider PEI report.
So let's take a look at the PEI matrix.
All right. So let me try and explain the matrix. From looking at the right, those are the countries that the report ranked most difficult to complete payroll in. So those three factors: complexity, software maturity, and talent availability. And moving from the bottom to the top are those that the CloudPay dataset showed to be most efficient in terms of they were scoring, on average, they were approving payroll first time more frequently than those lower down the grid. So left, less difficult; right, more difficult; up, easier or more often getting a first time approval; lower down, less often. So I think, again, there's some surprises on here for me. Brazil, I'm not surprised it's being ranked as the most difficult, but I am surprised by how often it gets a first time approval. I think one of those factors could be to do with you often have an advanced run where there's not a lot of data moving in Brazil, so that might be slightly pushing up the score. But also, if you consider the number of times that an off-cycle runs in Brazil to do a holiday payout or a termination run, it's surprising with the amount going on, they still find enough time to focus on getting the inputs, the calculations, and the validation done first time to such an extent. If I go somewhere else, I'm looking at Germany. I'm guessing for Germany, particularly over this period, I'm not surprised that it's suffering a bit from a low first time approval. This report was from 2020, so the first year of the pandemic, and where a lot of governments were offering COVID employer and employee relief schemes, and Germany particularly had a shortened working hours change, which led to payroll systems being needed to rapidly update with calculations. And at least for the first few months of those, a lot of those calculations were being performed manually by payroll teams. So I'm not surprised to see Germany suffering a bit on first time approval. If I look over at the left at some of the countries that were considered less difficult to do payroll, I think I'm also a little bit surprised to see Canada so far to the left, but also Ireland sitting so low down on the first time approval rate. So when we're looking at these holistically and you know, with your own company data, you could also do this kind of exercise yourself to kind of identify certain jurisdictions that might need some focus. It'd be interesting to hear your views on that matrix and what you thought about it.
And I know we're going to take a look at some of the challenges the pandemic's presented to payroll organizations shortly. If you have any questions, I saw a question about the US, and yes, the US does have a place here, but we didn't put everything on this grid. You can actually get to see how every one of those countries scored by downloading the report, which we'll share at the end of the presentation here. But yes, there are a lot more countries that we could have put on this matrix. Where does the UK sit within this matrix? John, do you want to opine on that?
I'm gonna put I'm gonna say the UK is probably to the left in terms of difficulty. I think there's some great software available in the UK to really drive an effective payroll process. Although the requirements aren't easy by any means, they are certainly a lot less complex than what you will see in France or Italy, for example. So I'm going to put it slightly to the left. And then I'm going to say first time approval. I'm going to say probably not so high. The reason for that is I think maybe in the UK we have a tendency to reject a payroll and let some new data in and reprocess it. And maybe that's dragging it down a little bit. So I'm going to put UK somewhere around Malaysia, Hong Kong, Portugal and UAE, somewhere in there.
Do you want to take one more question on this?
I'd love to. I mean,
yeah. All right. Well, this one's tough. I'm actually curious what you're going to say here as well. Do you think there's a difference between what this would look like if you look at white collar versus blue collar workers?
Absolutely. I think that's a great call out. So even within a country, the difficulty can vary considerably. One of the big drivers would be white collar to blue collar. Blue collar tend to have a lot more pay components moving around, and in certain countries will have much more complex collective agreements driving the underlying rules and regulations. But other things at country level that can drive the difficulty are whether or not your company has inherited or allowed a lot of complicated company specific calculations, such as vacation allowances or absence policies or stocks and RSUs and overtime and shift allowance, and all these different things, even in the country level, can make a massive difference to how difficult that payroll is for the payroll practitioner. So it's a great question.
Thank you. Let's get some more audience participation in here. Mel, I believe we have another poll.
Yes, we do. So the next question is, has the pandemic had a positive or negative effect on your payroll process? So I'm just going to launch that now. Okay, guys, what do you, John, I'll let you go first on this one.
I'm really hoping, and from my perspective, the outcome, not the actual experience, the outcome I think has been generally positive for the payroll industry. We've seen a lot of decommissioning of old technology. Sending payslips out in the post became a little bit harder when we were all in lockdown. And a lot of people took that as a driver, enabler to move to electronic payslip. I think other manual practices that may have been present in a payroll process, such as collecting manual timesheets and other fun things like that, they kind of weren't able to exist anymore in the new remote working environment that a lot of us found ourselves in. So I'm hoping a lot of us, oh yeah, the dog agrees, a lot of us found a more positive experience as an outcome from the pandemic. But interesting to hear what the folks are saying.
Well, John, she always has to make an appearance in every webinar recently, so the joys of working from home. So I'll end the poll and then let's see the results. Are these surprising?
I'm not surprised. I'm happy to see more positive than negative, I guess. But it'd be interesting to find out, again, if you can put something briefly on the chat as to what for you made it more positive or what for you particularly made it more negative. Again, I think it'd be interesting for the rest of the folks to see on the chat.
And David, I just noticed that somebody asked if this was going to be shared. So we will send the recording and the slides out to everyone at the end of today's session. So I'll stop sharing now and I'll pass it over to you, David.
Thank you, Mel. Thank you for participating in the poll. I think we're going to take a look at some of the factors that contributed, positive and negative, to payroll during the pandemic. John?
All right, great. So I think the perspective on this particular conversation is the first time we published this set of KPIs and the results was 2018. You can take yourself back then. It was a time when we could go to the office and work, we could go to another country on holiday, all those fun things. Second set of data was 2020, clearly the first year of the pandemic, and everybody trying to really quickly go from that normal working environment down to most of us working from home. So that remote working changed. I think everyone on this call would have experienced there was a lot of COVID relief schemes offered by local governments to both help employers and employees through some very challenging times. The result for the payroll teams, well, they were getting a lot of changes in social security rates, delays in making settlements, short-term working challenges, furlough calculations, all these fun things, that it was really difficult for the software to keep up with those changes. And so a lot of payroll teams were having to manually cover that new calculation until the software could catch up and automate that calculation. So that was a big impact in the early days of COVID. And we noticed that happening all over the globe in all regions. Third thing that was a big factor was the collection of data and processing. A payroll system needs all of the correct data at the right time in order to get it to the right calculation, to get that timeliness, to get that accuracy. Having to move from being in an office environment where that practice and that process was embedded, it was standard to everybody, almost overnight going to a home working environment, remote working environment, dealing with all of the other challenges that the outside world was throwing at us, put a lot of stress on payroll teams, on everybody, but for us, let's focus on payroll teams. So overall, when we first started to talk about how would we expect these results to look in compared 2018 to 2020, the expectation was that we would see a reduction in the overall efficiency of the payroll process and a reduction of those KPIs. And that's not what we saw. We saw a lot of KPIs actually improve over this period, which left us scratching our chins and our heads a little, wondering, what could be the explanation? And after some long debate, some thoughts we had on what was driving this increase, this improvement in efficiency was, I think, during the pandemic, I think because employers lost a lot of that engagement with their employees, payroll became that one thing that kept that engagement, that kept that relationship with their employee. The focus from the employer to ensure their employees were being paid timely and accurately was even more important. I mean, it's really, really important, but it's even more important at the start of the pandemic to help stop or to not contribute to your employees' discomfort. So I think the organizations as a whole started to put a lot more focus on their payroll process, supporting their payroll teams, who by default were there supporting their employees. So I think that might be one explanation as why we saw a slight improvement in the metric. So another idea, another observation we thought might be happening was that vendors were being more flexible during this pandemic. I certainly hope they were for everybody. So what do we mean by being flexible? Well, understanding that the gathering of the data might be more difficult for certain customers, so allowing them more time to get that done. Allowing the customers to introduce on very short notice new pay codes, whether that was from a government-led employee relief scheme or whether they were just doing their own, I need to set up a COVID relief payment for my employees who are clearly suffering. All of these things, I hope vendors applied a bit more flexibility to help their customers and the whole profession through that 2020 period. So that's some of our thoughts on what we've seen.
Thank you, John. I think you've alluded to it, but now let's look at some of the differences between 2018 and 2020 data. Marlene, can I invite you to walk us through this?
Absolutely. Thanks, David. So John had the nice, fun, exciting part of the presentation with the polls and all of that stuff, but I get a little bit of the geeky side where we go and compare some of those stats from 2018 to 2020. I don't know about you guys. I thought the responses on the poll were so interesting, because I know I went into this when we first started talking about this webinar with my own perception and my own ideas. And I really just had to push that stuff aside and really focus on the data that was presented on the report. So I found the results quite interesting, but let's go ahead and get started. At a global level, the 2020 results were actually very encouraging despite all the challenges that were posed by the pandemic. So I know, again, as I mentioned, I was pleasantly surprised at all of the results. So we're going to stick with the same metrics that John went through earlier, but we'll look at a couple of ones that surprised me. So the data input issues going down by a full 4.2%. And then, of course, the issues per payslip, per 1,000 payslips also dropped significantly, which, you know, again, absolutely fantastic. There was a lot happening in 2020. We've heard John talk about how, you know, individuals had to pivot from their usual way of working. So to see that stat drop, I thought was really, really interesting. But with that said, we're also being counterbalanced there with the number of supplemental runs increasing by that full 4.2%. So as we go through the slides, we're going to start to connect some of these dots and really find out the direct correlation between all of the different stats that we're looking at here. Okay, so supplemental impact versus the calendar length. You know, for me, there's a particular interesting finding from looking at this report, that there is a clear correlation between the countries with the highest supplemental impact and those with the shortest calendar length. You know, mostly countries across the Americas, but now we're seeing some specific EMEA countries showing up as well. So, you know, Brazil, Argentina, and Russia, they have completely retained their spots in the top 5 highest supplemental impact. But this year they were joined, or in 2020, they were joined by Colombia and Spain, which kind of booted Bolivia and Chile out of that top 5 list. So, and this could be for different things. You know, the Russian culture of having to conduct supplemental runs for bonuses every month contributes to that figure going up, while Spanish regulations require supplemental runs to cover all employee absences. And then we see something similar in Brazil, as John mentioned earlier, with your separations or, you know, terminations, as well as holiday pays having to be done on a supplemental run. So from our standpoint, we fully expect these types of behaviors from specific countries based on the regulations. But then for other countries, we really started to look at this, and maybe it's because of their calendar lengths that are so short that payroll is now being rushed and the appropriate checks, quality assurance, aren't fully being carried out properly. So that could be a trigger that is increasing that supplemental rate. As a result, more supplemental runs, of course, are being required as well to potentially correct errors from, you know, things being missed. You know, we talked about hourly employees. The classic example that, you know, I would always hear is, I'm having to chase managers to approve time data. Or it could be, you know, commissions having to be approved and then being sent in. So there's a variety of different bits of information that we may not be getting at that right time. And then having to run that in a supplemental run post payroll. Okay, now for the really fun part, we're going to have a friendly competition amongst across the 3 different regions. So we're going to be spending a little bit of time looking at the Americas, EMEA, as well as the APAC performance and how they really stack up and compare against each other. So for me, I've spent majority of my professional career working with the Americas region. So I think I was pleasantly shocked with some of the results that we found throughout this exercise and through the payroll. So the results for the America region compared to the 2018 data show an increase in overall performance efficiency. Of the three regions on this report, when we compared it with, with the best performance against all of the different metrics taken into account, this one had the best overall performance, which again, to me, it was, I think I was pleasantly surprised, as I mentioned earlier. So looking at what we have here, so the FTA, or that first time approval rate, increased by 1.77%, bringing that to a 84.41%. So that's over 12 percentage points clear over the other two regions. I think that was a first for the Americas. It also closed the gap on the data input issues with a 6.4 reduction, and it brought it more in line to what we're accustomed to seeing in APAC as well as in EMEA. So now bringing it into that 70% slot. So that's also really, really promising. It achieved the biggest reductions per 1,000 payslips. So it was a 35% compared to what we will see in the other regions of a 22% for APAC and EMEA. So it's closed that gap a little bit. Maybe there's still some work there left to do, but it's nice to see, and that also on that stat, it's more in line to what we would expect. The supplemental impact, I think, is where the region's going to continue to struggle. But, however, it's only increased by 1%. So if we think of, traditional items or traditional things that do happen, mostly in the South America region, there's usually already a high volume of supplementals happening just naturally. So to have that increase by just 1%, bringing that figure to that 39.7, I still think it's good, even though it is more than double of what we're seeing in EMEA as well. And I believe, like triple of what we're seeing in Asia Pac. So I think there's a lot of different things that attribute to it. So things like that shortened calendar length, having to run more runs throughout the month, and having that supplementals, be the point of remediation taking place to correct some of that that data coming in or data not coming into the payroll.
Arlene, would you like to take a question?
I sure would.
Is there any insight, this is for Nikki, is there any insight on whether supplemental runs are due to compliance versus missed data?
I could probably track that down, and based off of the different countries. We do have a way of tracking that within our systems and get a complete breakdown percentage of what is just required. And that's just based on the type of supplemental that we're doing. So, in Brazil, let's just use that country as an example. We treat the monthly advance run essentially as an early supplemental. So that's not data correction. That's not anything. It's actually not even a statutory item. It is truly just a company specific. It's a company benefit to the employees. So we do have a way to categorize these things and be able to tie that down to what may be a company rule or preference, what's a statutory item, and then what's just truly a correction in the payroll.
Thank you, Marlene. So Nikki, feel free to reach out to us. We can cut the data that way as well. So let's see how this compares to EMEA.
Moving over to the EMEA region, it's shown signs of improvement across several of the metrics over the past 2 years, but it has been the lowest performing out of all of the three different regions. So again, starting with that first time approval, its rate improved by 1.29%, bringing that to that 71.89. although it's fallen behind Asia Pac, we did still get to see that improvement, but it is still falling behind the APAC region in ranking. However, it does remain the leader in keeping the data input issues to a minimum. So it improved by a full 3.3%, bringing that rate to the 67.8%. And right now for us, it's the only region that we have under a 70% mark. So that's a big plus there for EMEA. It does continue to lag behind in the issues per 1,000 payslips, but it still improved there. We still saw that 22% reduction. So there was improvement, even though it's falling a little bit behind of what we're seeing in some of the other two regions. The EMEA also posted a small increase in calendar length. So it went from 5.9 days to 6.1. So very, very small. But there was that bit of a rise there, and there was a significant rise in the supplemental impact rate as well. So that went from 10.7% to a full 15.3, which is an increase of 43% over the 2 years. So that's a big jump there. I know, working with John many years, he always asked me why we had so many supplementals in the Americas. So John, now it's your turn to see that in the EMEA region. So many of these issues have arisen in EMEA from results of COVID-specific measures being taken into place in several different countries. As we're going through this, we've heard of some of those examples, and we've actually read through them in the chat comments that you guys are placing. But things like, Germany implementing shortened working hours, a move that would have had a huge impact for the payroll statuses of every employee within the organization. So as many of these changes occurred, they were happening pretty much almost in real time. It was very short notice. And then it became even more challenging to adapt, because some of the teams that now were having to implement these changes were also part of that change. So again, with the Germany example, with the shortened working hours, that applied to the payroll teams as well. So maybe there's a little bit of a correlation there in some of those regulations, and us seeing that calendar time go up, where things may have had to carry over to another day because the working hours per day were shortened.
Marlene, I'm going to throw another question your way, and John, feel free to chime into this one as well, because I know you're involved in annual business reviews with our customers. And this is around data input issues. So I'm going to combine a question that Paul has posed with what Salvatore has asked. So the data input issues seem high across Americas and EMEA. And how much of that is stemming from the client's submission of data? And then broadly, how is presenting this data to customers driving behavioral changes in how they submit data and what they do upstream to drive down those input issues?
I think it's a really interesting question. Once you start to specifically identify data input issues and how we're capturing them from our side, it is when you have an error loading that data. So it's an error with how that data has been presented to the processor. So when you share that in this example with our customer and give them a mechanism that allows them to identify that error has occurred in that particular country, then drill down to it to understand which wage type or pay code or earning type that error is occurring on, or whether it's some master data. It allows that customer then to work internally to understand where in that process they need to make an adjustment. That might be them combining with a different department, might be speaking with the HRIS team because it might be coming from an integration. But it really allows them to take some action, and you're giving them the information that allows them to manage better with their internal stakeholders. And hopefully the outcome, which again, if you take these measures every month, you can track how this goes over time, up or down. They can then hopefully make some adjustments and see the amount of data input issues dropping over time, which is a really, really important part of the payroll process. So I believe it's really important that that data is available, and available real detailed as to the exact file, the exact data type, because what you've got to do with that is get into some root cause analysis and then go and figure out the solution and implement that solution, and then be able to track the effectiveness of that fix you've put in.
Thanks, John. So so you are seeing this data try to drive behavioral changes upstream.
Absolutely. Having that data available as a transactional data source, not a comment or a feeling that the payroll team has, allows the customer payroll team to take that factual information and go and use that to manage other parts of their business to get the improvement that they're wishing. It's just a much more effective, less emotional way of communicating with other departments that you need a behavioral change or a process change or a system change from them to enable you to be able to perform your payroll process more effectively.
Great. Thanks, John. Marlene, anything to add there, or do you want to go look at APAC?
No, we can go ahead and look at APAC. I'm trying to keep an eye on the time, so.
Yeah, me too. Go ahead.
So in line with the other regions, what we're seeing on the APAC results, again, there's still a lot of room for optimism, and it's ranking second out of all of the 3 regions. So APAC posted the highest increase in first-time approvals, so that's 4.2%, allowing it to reach that 72.1 and essentially overtake the EMEA region. So there's a lot happening. I feel like all these regions are knocking each other around in rank on different stats. It's also consolidated its position as the leader in minimizing the issues per 1,000 payslips. So reducing that by that 22% that we're seeing here. So that's a big, big plus. Despite the increase, furthermore, despite the increase of the 1.71%, it can largely be attributed to the circumstances rather than the errors. So its supplemental impact rate of 11.4 makes that, the leader amongst the 3 different regions. It did reduce the number of input issues by that 3.7. So now it's the lowest performing region on that specific metrics. With APAC as well, it has the longest calendar length. So we did see an increase on that calendar length, going up to 6.2 days, despite it being the only region that posted a reduction in calendar length. So, interesting to see these different statistics and what's happening there with the Asia Pacific region.
And just keeping an eye on time, let's talk a little bit about what it takes to get payroll right.
Yeah. All right, so I'm looking forward to the comments that I'm going to get once we post this slide. I've been trying to keep an eye on some of the things going back and forth in the chat. But, honestly, global payroll requires a handful of challenges to be resolved. And I know it's easier said than done. Again, I'm fully expecting some great, insightful comments coming up as we go through this slide. But, just keep an open mind, and here are just some things to help you focus as you move through that global standardization journey. So we'll start off with the standardized piece. So payroll, HR, and finance data should be standardized across the organization. When this is in place, it's then possible to implement standardized processes, workflows, data management protocols, and payroll systems globally. This consistency will then enable analysis to become more reliable as well as relevant everywhere. Moving to the integrate piece. So by connecting your global payroll to other functions like human resources, you're now, your organization can now work off of a single source of information. That eliminates the insecure data management, things like email attachments or manual entry, or, you know, I can't tell you guys how many times I hear we provide our payroll inputs in a Word document and we email it off to our vendors. So things like that make the process very difficult. It also makes the downstream impact of auditing payroll very, very difficult because you're now having to chase data down across, you know, emails and documents and things like that. Automate. So deploying a process automation enables simplification of repetitive labor-intensive processes. So this is where you're going to see some of those efficiencies in helping reduce the difficulty of managing large volumes of data effectively. So introducing things like robotic data validation automates the checking of the payroll data very, very quickly, allowing your teams to get, you know, reduce the errors in the payroll, as well as the time it takes to validate all of those payrolls. And lastly is ACT. So for continuous improvement, it's critical to success is having a culture of willingness to believe what the data is showing, and then to collaborate across teams and take the appropriate action. This requires strong working relationship between customers, vendors, as well as cross-functional teams within the organization. So, you know, I know this is probably, you know, it's all very difficult, and most of you might be thinking, yeah, well, why don't you come here and do all of those things? But I will say, especially on that ACT piece, I started out my piece of this presentation telling you that I came into this with my own perception of thinking that I knew what the results were going to be. And if there's a biggest takeaway from here, at least for my part, is to really allow the data to tell the story. Leave, you know, kind of your assumptions behind, allow the data to tell the story, and then, you know, we can do things like John mentioned of making those improvements because we know those specific areas that need to be improved upon. So that was all on my part. I'll hand it back over to you, David.
Thank you, Marlene. And I know we're wrapping up here, so I want to give you some details around how you can get your hands on this report. You can scan that QR code if you're holding your phone, or you can go to cloudpay.com/PEI report. This report is launching today. There's a lot of detail we went through that is region and country specific. You can get a lot more information on these in the report, so I encourage you to get your hands on it. And we will shortly be releasing a follow-up report to this in about a quarter. In about 3 months, that'll look at 2021 data. So it'll be interesting to see how the data stabilizes as organizations got used to the changes the pandemic required. I want to thank the panelists, Bell, GPA. Thank you so much for hosting us and letting us share this wonderful data.
Thank you so much. Thank you to everyone at CloudPay, and John, Marlene and David. What a fantastic webinar, so much information. So it'd be so interesting to see what happens in 2021 just to see what the changes will be, or if there'll be changes and what they'll be. As I said earlier, we have recorded this. We also have the slides. If you have any problems not being able to access the port, contact us and we can pass you over to the team at CloudPay. But thank you all once again, and I hope to see you again in one of our future webinars. Thank you.
Thank you.